Hashtag the hunter's daughter, Sarah Martinez, had always been different from other girls in the small mountain town of Pine Ridge. While her classmates spent their weekends at the mall or texting friends, she was deep in the wilderness with her father, learning skills that most people only saw in movies. Her father, Miguel Martinez, was a former Marine sniper who had served 3 tours overseas before returning home to raise his daughter alone after her mother died in a car accident when Sarah was just 8 years old. The morning sun cast long shadows across the forest floor as Sarah moved silently through the dense undergrowth. Her custom-built hunting rifle, a gift from her father for her 18th birthday just 2 months ago, felt like a natural extension of her body. The weapon was a work of art, carefully modified and tuned to perfection. Every component had been selected with precision, from the lightweight carbon fiber stock to the high-end scope that could pick out a target at incredible distances. She had been tracking the injured buck for over an hour now. The animal had been hit by a car the night before and had wandered into the deep woods, wounded and suffering. The local wildlife officer had asked Miguel if he and Sarah could help put the animal out of its misery, knowing that the Martinez family were among the best marksmen in 3 counties. Sarah crouched behind a fallen log, studying the tracks in the soft earth. The buck was favoring its left front leg, and from the spacing of the hoof prints, she could tell it was moving slowly, probably in considerable pain. Her father had taught her that a clean, quick kill was not just about skill with a weapon, but about respect for the animal and understanding of its suffering. The tracking had led her deeper into the national forest than she had originally planned. She was now at least 5 miles from the nearest road, in an area where cell phone coverage was spotty at best. The terrain here was rough, with steep ravines, thick stands of pine trees, and rocky outcroppings that made navigation challenging even for experienced outdoors people. As she moved forward, following the blood trail that marked the buck's passage, Sarah began to notice something that made her uneasy. There were other tracks here, recent ones. Boot prints that didn't belong to any of the local hunters she knew. The prints were from heavy combat boots, and there were at least 4 different sets of them, all moving in the same direction as the wounded buck. Sarah had heard rumors around town lately about strangers in the area, people who didn't belong, who were asking too many questions about local families, especially those with military backgrounds. Her father had served with distinction, and his reputation as a skilled marksman was well known throughout the region. Miguel had told Sarah to be extra careful lately, to stay alert and trust her instincts if anything seemed wrong. The boot prints were following the same trail she was tracking, and they were fresh, probably made within the last few hours. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she realized that whoever made these tracks might still be nearby. She checked her rifle, ensuring that the safety was off and that she had a round chambered. Her father had drilled into her the importance of being prepared, of always assuming that danger could be just around the next tree. Moving even more carefully now, Sarah continued following the trail. The forest seemed quieter than usual, with fewer bird calls and less rustling in the underbrush. Animals had a way of sensing danger, and their silence was often a warning that something was wrong. Sarah had learned to read these signs from her father, who had developed such skills during his time as a military scout. After another 20 minutes of careful tracking, Sarah heard voices ahead. She immediately dropped into a crouch and moved toward the sound, using every bit of cover available. Through a gap in the trees, she could see a small clearing where the wounded buck lay on its side, clearly dying but still breathing. Standing around the animal were 4 men in military-style clothing, all carrying weapons. These were not local hunters or wildlife officials. Their gear was too new, too expensive, and too military for that. They wore tactical vests, communication headsets, and carried automatic weapons that definitely were not legal for hunting. Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized that these men were professionals, and they were not here for the buck. One of the men, apparently the leader, was speaking into a radio. Sarah couldn't make out all the words from her position, but she caught enough to understand that they were talking about her father. They knew Miguel Martinez by name, knew about his military service, and were discussing plans to capture him. The word interrogation came through clearly, along with references to intelligence assets and extraction protocols. Sarah's mind raced as she processed what she was hearing. These men were some kind of military or intelligence operatives, and they were planning to kidnap her father. But why? Miguel had been out of the service for over 10 years, working as a civilian contractor for a local construction company. What could they possibly want with him? As she listened more carefully, pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The men were discussing something about classified information that Miguel might have from his time overseas, something about weapon systems, and tactical intelligence that apparently had value even after all these years. They mentioned other veterans in the area who had already been collected for questioning. One of the men checked his watch and spoke to the others. They were planning to move on Miguel within the next few hours, while Sarah was supposed to be out hunting and unable to interfere. They had been watching the family, learning their routines, waiting for the right moment to strike. Sarah knew she had to warn her father, but she was miles from any road, and even if she could get back to town, these men might reach Miguel first. Her cell phone showed no signal, and the radio in her truck was too far away to be useful. She was on her own, with only her rifle and the skills her father had taught her. The wounded buck chose that moment to let out a pained cry, drawing the attention of all four men. The leader gestured to one of his companions, who raised his weapon to put the animal out of its misery. But as he took aim, he happened to glance in Sarah's direction and spotted her crouched behind the trees. "Contact!" he shouted, bringing his weapon around toward her position. Sarah's training kicked in instantly. Her father had taught her to shoot not just accurately, but quickly and under pressure. She brought her rifle up smoothly, acquired her target through the scope, and fired in one fluid motion. The man who had spotted her dropped immediately, his weapon falling to the ground beside him. The other three men scattered for cover, shouting commands and trying to coordinate their response. But Sarah was already moving, using the terrain and her knowledge of the forest to her advantage. She had grown up in these woods, knew every rock and tree, every hidden path and concealed position. From a new firing position behind a large boulder, Sarah could see two of the remaining men trying to flank her position. She took careful aim at the closer one and fired again. Another clean hit, another enemy down. Her father had always told her that in a fight, accuracy was more important than speed, but in this situation, she was managing both. The remaining two men were now taking her seriously as a threat. They had stopped trying to capture her alive and were clearly shooting to kill. Bullets whined off the rocks around her position, sending stone chips flying through the air. Sarah kept her head down and tried to think of a way out of the situation. She had 2 rounds left in her rifle's magazine, and she could see both remaining enemies from her current position. But they were well concealed and alert to her presence. Any shot she took would have to be perfect, and she would need to move immediately afterward to avoid return fire. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, Sarah picked her first target and fired. The shot was true, catching the man as he leaned out from behind a tree to get a better angle on her position. That left one enemy, the leader, who was now alone and clearly reconsidering his tactical situation. "Listen, girl," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "You're good with that rifle, I'll give you that. But this doesn't have to end badly for you. We're not here for you. We just want to talk to your father. Put down the weapon and walk away, and nobody else has to get hurt." Sarah didn't respond immediately. She was trying to locate his exact position while considering her options. She had 1 round left in her rifle, and if she missed, she would be in serious trouble. The man was a professional soldier, probably with years of combat experience, and he would not make the same mistakes his companions had made. "I know you're thinking about it," the man continued. "You're probably wondering if you can take that last shot and end this. But what happens if you miss? What happens when more of my people come looking for us? Your father is going to be in a lot more trouble if you don't cooperate." Sarah realized that he was trying to get her to reveal her position by talking. Every time she spoke, he would be able to narrow down her location. She stayed silent and continued to scan the area where she thought he might be hiding. The forest had fallen completely silent now, as if all the wildlife had fled the area. Even the wounded buck had stopped making noise, probably having finally succumbed to its injuries. The only sounds were the whisper of wind through the pine trees and the distant call of a hawk somewhere overhead. Sarah caught a glimpse of movement near the edge of the clearing and brought her rifle around. But as she lined up the shot, she heard footsteps behind her. Somehow, the leader had managed to circle around and approach her position from the rear. She spun around just as he emerged from the trees, his weapon trained on her. "Drop the rifle, now," he commanded, his voice calm and professional. Sarah found herself looking down the barrel of a military assault rifle, held by a man who clearly knew how to use it. She was caught completely off guard, her own weapon pointed in the wrong direction. Any attempt to bring it around would result in her being shot before she could get off a round. Reluctantly, she lowered her rifle and placed it on the ground beside her. "Good girl," the man said, keeping his weapon trained on her. "Now step back, away from the rifle." Sarah did as instructed, her mind racing as she tried to think of a way out of the situation. The man moved forward and kicked her rifle away, sending it sliding across the rocky ground until it came to rest against a tree several yards away. "That's a nice piece of equipment," he said, glancing at the rifle. "Custom work, expensive components. Your father taught you well. In fact, that's exactly why we need to have a conversation with him." The man reached for something on his tactical vest, probably a radio to call for backup or to report that he had captured her. But as he took his attention off her for just a moment, Sarah made her move. Her father had taught her more than just how to shoot. He had also taught her hand-to-hand combat, the same techniques he had learned in the Marines. Sarah had spent countless hours practicing these moves, never thinking she would actually need to use them in a life-or-death situation. She lunged forward, grabbing the barrel of his rifle with her left hand while driving her right elbow toward his face. The man was caught off guard by the sudden attack and stumbled backward, trying to maintain control of his weapon. But Sarah had surprise on her side, and her father had taught her to be aggressive and decisive in close combat. The fight that followed was brief, but intense. The man was bigger and stronger than Sarah, but she was faster and had the advantage of having made the first move. She managed to wrench the rifle away from him and deliver several quick strikes before he could recover his balance. But as the man fell to the ground, unconscious from a blow to the head, Sarah heard the sound that made her blood run cold. The unmistakable noise of helicopters approaching from the distance, growing louder by the second. Sarah grabbed her rifle and ran for the dense cover of the forest, knowing that her real fight was just beginning. The sound of war, the helicopter blades grew louder, chopping through the mountain air with mechanical precision. Sarah sprinted through the underbrush, branches whipping at her face as she put distance between herself and the clearing where she had just fought for her life. Her rifle bounced against her back as she ran, secure by the tactical sling her father had insisted she always use. Behind her, she could hear the aircraft settling into the clearing, followed immediately by the sound of boots hitting the ground. Radio chatter echoed through the trees as more soldiers spread out to search for her. These were not the same kind of men she had just defeated. From the sound of their voices and the efficiency of their movements, Sarah knew she was now facing a much larger and better organized force. She had to get back to town, had to warn her father before they reached him. But the direct route would take her right through areas where the soldiers were likely to set up checkpoints and ambush positions. Instead, she would have to take the long way around, using game trails and creek beds that most people didn't even know existed. Sarah's knowledge of the local terrain was her greatest advantage now. She had been hiking and hunting in these mountains since she was old enough to walk. Every ridge, every valley, every hidden path was as familiar to her as the rooms in her own house. The soldiers might have superior numbers and equipment, but they were strangers in her territory. Moving as quietly as possible, she made her way toward a narrow ravine that cut through the mountainside. The rocky walls would provide cover from aerial surveillance, and the creek that ran along the bottom would help mask any noise she made. It would add at least 2 hours to her journey, but it was the safest route available. As she descended into the ravine, Sarah could hear the soldiers spreading out through the forest above her. They were using tactical radio communications, coordinating their search patterns like a well-trained military unit. Occasionally, she caught fragments of their conversations, enough to confirm her worst fears. They were not just after her father. This was a much larger operation, targeting multiple veterans throughout the region. Names she recognized were being mentioned over the radio, men who had served with her father or in similar units. All of them were being classified as priority targets for capture and interrogation. Sarah paused in her movement, pressing herself against the rocky wall of the ravine as a helicopter passed overhead. The aircraft was equipped with thermal imaging equipment, she realized, watching as searchlights swept back and forth across the forest canopy. Staying in the ravine was the right choice. The cold water of the creek and the stone walls would help hide her heat signature from their sensors. The creek was running higher than usual due to recent rains, and Sarah had to be careful with her footing on the slippery rocks. A fall here could result in injury, and she could not afford to be slowed down. Every minute that passed was another minute for the soldiers to reach her father, and she knew that once they had him, the chances of getting him back alive were slim. As she made her way downstream, Sarah's mind kept returning to the conversation she had overheard in the clearing. The soldiers had mentioned classified information, something valuable enough to justify a major military operation on American soil. Her father had always been reluctant to talk about his time overseas, saying only that some things were better left in the past. But now Sarah wondered what secrets Miguel Martinez might be carrying, and why someone would go to such lengths to extract that information after so many years. Her father had been a sniper, trained to work behind enemy lines and gather intelligence on high-value targets. He had been decorated for his service, receiving commendations that he kept in a box in his closet and never talked about. The sound of the helicopters was fading now, moving away toward the town. Sarah felt a surge of panic as she realized that they might already be making their move on her father. She picked up her pace, splashing through the creek as quietly as possible while trying to make good time. After an hour of following the ravine, Sarah reached a point where she could climb out and take a more direct route toward town. The terrain here was rough, with steep slopes covered in loose rock that made climbing treacherous. But it would also be difficult for the soldiers to follow her, especially if they were not familiar with the local geography. As she climbed, Sarah could see smoke rising from the direction of town. Not the normal kind of smoke from chimneys or campfires, but the thick black smoke that came from burning vehicles or buildings. Her heart sank as she realized that the operation was already underway, and it was much larger than she had initially thought. From her elevated position, Sarah could see several helicopters circling the town, and what appeared to be roadblocks set up on all the main routes leading in and out of Pine Ridge. The soldiers had effectively sealed off the entire area, trapping everyone inside while they conducted their operation. Sarah knew she had to get into town, but the direct approaches were clearly being watched. She would have to find another way, using the network of hiking trails and logging roads that crisscrossed the mountainside. It would be dangerous, but she was running out of options. Making her way along a ridge that overlooked the town, Sarah could see military vehicles positioned at strategic locations throughout Pine Ridge. This was not just a kidnapping operation. It was a full military occupation of her hometown. The implications of what she was witnessing were staggering. How could a foreign military force simply take over an American town without anyone knowing about it? Unless they were not foreign at all, Sarah realized with a growing sense of horror. The equipment, the tactics, the level of organization all suggested that these were American forces possibly operating under some kind of classified authority. Her father and the other veterans were being targeted by their own government for reasons that Sarah could not begin to understand. As she watched from her concealed position, Sarah saw soldiers going door to door through the residential areas of town. They seemed to have specific addresses, probably a list of targets that had been prepared in advance. The operation was too organized, too precise to be a random sweep. Sarah spotted her own neighborhood in the distance and felt sick when she saw smoke rising from the direction of her house. Either her home was on fire, or her father had put up resistance, and there had been a firefight. Either way, it meant that she was probably too late to warn him. But she had to know for sure. Sarah began working her way down the mountainside, using every bit of cover available to avoid detection. The soldiers seemed to be concentrating on the town itself, leaving the surrounding hills relatively unguarded. It was a tactical mistake that Sarah intended to exploit. Moving from tree to tree, rock to rock, Sarah gradually made her way closer to her neighborhood. The sounds of the occupation grew louder as she approached. Helicopter engines, vehicle motors, radio chatter, and occasionally the sound of gunfire from somewhere in the town. When she finally reached a position where she could see her house, Sarah's worst fears were confirmed. The building was still standing, but there were obvious signs of battle. Bullet holes marked the walls, windows were shattered, and the front door hung open on its hinges. Military vehicles were parked in the driveway and on the street in front of the house. Sarah could see soldiers moving in and out of the building, carrying equipment and what appeared to be evidence bags. They were conducting a thorough search, looking for something specific. Documents, perhaps, or electronic devices that might contain the classified information they were after. But there was no sign of her father, dead or alive. Sarah realized that Miguel might have escaped, or he might have been taken to another location for interrogation. Either way, she needed to find out what had happened and where he might be. The only way to do that was to get closer and try to gather intelligence on the soldiers' activities. Moving carefully through the shadows, Sarah made her way to a position behind her neighbor's house where she could observe the activity at her own home. From this vantage point, she could hear the soldiers talking as they went about their work. No sign of the target. One of them reported into his radio. "House is clear, but it looks like he put up a fight before he left." "Copy that," came the response from the radio. "Continue the search. Command wants any documents or electronic devices that might contain classified material." "Roger. What about the daughter? Any word on her location?" "Negative. Last report had her pinned down in Sector 7, but she managed to evade capture. All units are to consider her armed and extremely dangerous." Sarah felt a grim satisfaction at hearing that. She had not only escaped from their ambush, but she had apparently impressed them enough to be considered a serious threat. Her father's training had served her well, but she knew that her real test was still to come. As she listened to more radio traffic, Sarah began to piece together a clearer picture of the operation. There were multiple teams conducting simultaneous raids throughout the region, targeting a specific list of veterans. The operation had been planned for months, with detailed intelligence gathered on each target's habits, family members, and potential escape routes. But something had gone wrong with the timeline. The radio chatter indicated that several targets had managed to escape before the raids began, as if they had been warned in advance. This had forced the soldiers to expand their operation and lock down the entire area while they searched for the missing veterans. Sarah's father was among those who had escaped the initial raids, but she had no idea where he might have gone. Miguel was a careful man, trained in evasion and survival, and he had always told Sarah that if anything ever happened, she should meet him at a specific location in the mountains where they used to camp when she was younger. The old hunting cabin was about 15 miles from town, accessible only by a rough trail that was barely passable even with a four-wheel drive vehicle. It was the perfect place to hide from a military search, and Sarah was fairly certain that her father would head there if he had managed to escape the raid on their house. But getting to the cabin would mean traveling through mountains that were now crawling with soldiers. Sarah would have to use every skill her father had taught her about moving unseen through hostile territory. It would be the most dangerous journey of her life, but it was her only chance of reuniting with Miguel and finding out what was really happening. As Sarah prepared to leave her observation post, she heard one of the soldiers inside her house make a discovery that chilled her to the bone. "Command, this is team leader," the voice said over the radio. "We found something. Hidden safe in the basement. Looks like it contains classified documents. We're going to need a specialist to crack it." "Copy that. Specialist team is en route to your location. Secure the area and wait for their arrival." Sarah realized that her father had been keeping classified documents in their house, hidden away where even she had not known about them. Whatever information those documents contained, it was important enough to justify this massive military operation. And now the soldiers were going to get their hands on it. But Sarah also remembered something her father had told her once during one of their camping trips. He had mentioned that if anything ever happened to him, there were people she could trust, veterans like himself, who would help her if she needed it. He had given her names and locations, information that she had filed away and never expected to need. Now, as she watched soldiers ransack her family home, Sarah realized that she might need to call on those contacts. She was no longer just trying to warn her father about danger. She was potentially the only person who could stop whatever conspiracy was unfolding around them. Taking one last look at her house, Sarah slipped away into the darkness, heading for the mountains and whatever answers awaited her at the old hunting cabin hashtag into the darkness. The journey through the mountains proved to be more treacherous than Sarah had anticipated. What should have been a familiar hike to her family's old hunting cabin had become a deadly game of cat and mouse with professional soldiers who seemed to know the terrain almost as well as she did. 3 times during the night, she had been forced to take shelter and wait for patrol helicopters to pass overhead, their searchlights cutting through the darkness like mechanical lightning. By dawn, Sarah had covered only half the distance to the cabin, and she was beginning to worry that she might not make it before the soldiers expanded their search grid to include the remote mountain areas. Her legs ached from hours of careful movement over rough terrain, and her water supply was running dangerously low. But as the sun began to rise over the mountain peaks, Sarah caught sight of something that made her heart leap with hope. Smoke was rising from the chimney of the old cabin, a thin wisp that would be invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. Her father was there, and he was alive. Sarah approached the cabin with extreme caution, remembering her father's lessons about never assuming that a safe location was actually safe. For all she knew, the soldiers might have found the cabin first and could be using it as a trap. She spent 20 minutes observing the building from concealment, looking for any signs that it might be compromised. Everything appeared normal. The cabin looked exactly as it had during their last family camping trip 2 years ago, weathered but solid, sitting in a small clearing surrounded by dense pine forest. The smoke from the chimney suggested that someone was inside, probably cooking breakfast or simply trying to stay warm in the cool mountain air. Finally, convinced that the area was secure, Sarah emerged from the tree line and approached the cabin's front door. Before she could knock, the door opened and her father stepped out, his hunting rifle in his hands and a look of relief on his weathered face. "Sarah," Miguel said, lowering his weapon and embracing his daughter. "Thank God you're safe. I heard the radio chatter about soldiers in the forest, and I was afraid they had captured you." "I'm okay, Dad," Sarah replied, holding him tightly. "But we have a big problem. There's soldiers all over the mountains, and they're looking for both of us. They've taken over the entire town." Miguel nodded grimly. "I know. I barely made it out of the house before they arrived. Had to go through the back window and into the storm drain that runs behind our neighborhood. Been monitoring their communications from here." Sarah looked around the interior of the cabin and was surprised to see that her father had been busy during his time here. The small building was equipped with military-style radio equipment, maps of the local area marked with tactical annotations, and what appear to be weapons and supplies that definitely had not been there during their family camping trips. "Dad, what's really going on?" Sarah asked. "Those soldiers mentioned classified information, something about your service record. Weren't you telling me?" Miguel was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window toward the mountains where they both knew armed men were hunting for them. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that Sarah had never heard before. During my last tour overseas, I was part of a classified operation. He began. We were tasked with gathering intelligence on weapons systems that were being developed by defense contractors for the military. What we discovered was that some of those contractors were selling the same technology to foreign governments, including countries that were considered hostile to the United States. Sarah listened in stunned silence as her father continued his explanation. My team documented everything we found. Names, dates, financial transactions, technical specifications for weapon systems that could be used against American soldiers. We turned over our evidence to our commanding officers, expecting that the appropriate authorities would investigate and prosecute the people responsible. But that's not what happened, Sarah said, already guessing where the story was heading. No, it's not, Miguel confirmed. Instead of investigations, there were cover-ups. People who had been involved in the illegal sales were promoted or transferred to positions where they could continue their activities. The evidence we had gathered was classified at the highest levels and buried so deep that it would never see the light of day. Miguel walked to a wall of the cabin where he had mounted several photographs and documents. Sarah could see images of military personnel, technical drawings of weapon systems, and what appeared to be bank records showing large financial transactions. My team members and I decided that we couldn't just let this slide, Miguel continued. We made copies of all the evidence before it could be completely buried. We agreed that if anything ever happened to any of us, the others would make sure that the information got out to the public. And now something has happened, Sarah said, beginning to understand the scope of what they were facing. 3 weeks ago, I got word that 2 of my former team members had died under suspicious circumstances. One was supposedly killed in a car accident, the other in a hunting accident. Both deaths were reported as being accidental, but I knew better. Someone was eliminating witnesses, and I was next on the list. Sarah felt a chill as she realized that her father had been living with this threat for weeks without telling her. Why didn't you say anything to me? I thought I could handle it quietly, Miguel admitted. I made contact with the surviving members of my team, and we agreed to meet this week to decide what to do with the evidence we had been keeping. But before we could get together, this military operation began. So those soldiers aren't here to capture you for interrogation, Sarah said. They're here to kill you and destroy the evidence. Most likely, yes. The people behind this conspiracy have enough influence to organize a military operation on American soil, which means they have resources and connections at the highest levels of government. They can't afford to let this information become public. Miguel led Sarah to a table where he had spread out maps of the local area. Red X marks indicated locations where his contacts had been killed or captured, and blue circles showed the positions of the military forces that were currently searching for them. The situation is worse than you know, Miguel said, pointing to the map. They've been systematically eliminating everyone who was involved in the original investigation. Out of 8 team members, only 3 of us are still alive, and we're all being hunted by the same people who were responsible for the cover-up in the first place. Sarah studied the map, trying to understand the tactical situation they were facing. The soldiers had effectively surrounded the entire region, making escape by normal routes impossible. But she also noticed something that gave her hope. "Dad, look at this," she said, pointing to an area of the map that showed a gap in the military perimeter. "There's a corridor here between these 2 patrol zones. If we could get through that area, we might be able to reach the interstate and get out of the region entirely." Miguel examined the area Sarah had identified. It's possible, but it would mean traveling through some of the most difficult terrain in the mountains. The route would take us through Devil's Canyon, which is barely passable even in good weather. But it's our only chance, Sarah pointed out. And we can't stay here. They'll find this cabin eventually, especially if they start using thermal imaging from the helicopters. Miguel nodded, accepting the reality of their situation. "You're right. We need to move, and soon. But first, there's something I need to show you." He led Sarah to a corner of the cabin where he had constructed a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. Inside the compartment was a waterproof case containing documents, photographs, and digital storage devices. "This is a complete copy of all the evidence we gathered," Miguel explained. "Names, financial records, technical specifications, everything that proves the illegal weapons sales were taking place. If anything happens to me, you need to get this information to someone who can make it public." Sarah took the case, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with it. "Who can we trust with something like this?" "There's a journalist named Rebecca Chun who works for the Washington Herald," Miguel said, handing Sarah a piece of paper with contact information. "She's been investigating defense contractor corruption for years, and she has the resources and credibility to handle this kind of story. If you can get this evidence to her, she'll know what to do with it." "We can get it to her together," Sarah said firmly. "We're both getting out of here alive." Miguel smiled at his daughter's determination, but Sarah could see the worry in his eyes. He knew better than she did how dangerous their situation really was, and how slim their chances of escape had become. "Before we leave, there's one more thing," Miguel said, walking to another hidden compartment. "I know they took your rifle, but I have something that might help." He pulled out a compact submachine gun, military issue, along with several magazines of ammunition. "I've been saving this for an emergency, and I think this qualifies." Sarah took the weapon, familiarizing herself with its operation. It was different from her hunting rifle, designed for close-quarters combat rather than precision shooting at long range. But her father had taught her to use various types of firearms, and she quickly adapted to the new weapon's handling characteristics. "One more thing," Miguel said, his voice growing serious. "If we get separated during the escape attempt, you need to promise me that you'll focus on getting that evidence to safety. Don't come back for me. Don't try to mount a rescue. The information in that case is more important than either of our lives." "Dad, I'm not leaving you behind," Sarah said firmly. "You might not have a choice," Miguel replied. "These people have already killed to protect their secrets, and they won't hesitate to kill again. Promise me that you'll put the mission first, no matter what happens." Sarah wanted to refuse, but she could see in her father's eyes that this was important to him. After a long moment, she nodded her agreement, though she had no intention of abandoning her father if things went wrong. They spent the next hour preparing for their escape attempt, checking equipment, studying maps, and planning their route through Devil's Canyon. The path would be treacherous, requiring them to traverse steep cliffs, cross fast-moving streams, and navigate through areas where a single wrong step could result in a fatal fall. But as they prepared to leave the cabin, the sound of helicopter rotors began to grow louder in the distance. The soldiers had found them, and their time for preparation had just run out. "Move," Miguel said, grabbing his pack and weapon. "We go now, or we don't go at all." Sarah slung the case containing the evidence across her back and followed her father out the rear exit of the cabin. Behind them, the sound of the approaching helicopters grew steadily louder, and Sarah knew that the most dangerous part of their journey was about to begin. The Devil's Canyon. The helicopter gunfire erupted just as Sarah and Miguel reached the edge of Devil's Canyon, bullets chewing up the ground around their feet and sending rock fragments flying through the air. The soldiers had found their cabin faster than expected, and now the two fugitives were trapped on a narrow ledge with nowhere to run except down into the treacherous canyon below. "This way," Miguel shouted over the noise of the rotors, pointing toward a steep trail that switched back down the canyon wall. "Stay low and move fast." Sarah followed her father down the precarious path, the waterproof case containing the evidence bouncing against her back with each hurried step. The trail was barely wide enough for one person, carved into the rock face by decades of erosion and the occasional hiker brave enough to attempt the descent. Behind them, the helicopter was having difficulty maneuvering in the narrow space between the canyon walls. The pilot was skilled, but the downdrafts and crosswinds created by the rock formations made precision flying nearly impossible. This gave Sarah and Miguel a temporary advantage, but they knew it wouldn't last long. As they descended, Sarah could hear the sound of rappelling equipment being deployed from the helicopter. The soldiers were preparing to fast rope down into the canyon, where the terrain would favor ground troops over aircraft. In a few minutes, they would be facing professional soldiers on foot in an environment where there was very little cover and even fewer escape routes. "Dad, we're not going to make it at this pace," Sarah called out as they navigated a particularly difficult section of the trail where they had to use handholds carved into the rock face. Miguel paused to look back at the helicopter, which was now hovering just above the canyon rim while soldiers prepared to descend. "I know. When we reach the bottom, we'll have to split up. You take the evidence and head for the south end of the canyon. There's an old mining road that will get you out to the highway." "What about you?" Sarah asked. Though she was afraid, she already knew the answer. "I'm going to lead them in the opposite direction. Buy you time to escape," Miguel replied. "Remember what you promised me back at the cabin." Sarah wanted to argue, but the sound of boots hitting the canyon floor behind them cut the conversation short. The soldiers had reached the bottom of the canyon and were already spreading out to begin their pursuit. Miguel and Sarah had perhaps a 5-minute head start, maybe less. They reached the canyon floor and immediately split up as planned. Sarah headed south, following a dry creek bed that provided some concealment from aerial observation. Behind her, she could hear Miguel moving in the opposite direction, deliberately making noise to attract the attention of their pursuers. The strategy worked, at least initially. Most of the soldiers followed Miguel's trail, drawn by the sounds of his movement through the underbrush. But Sarah could hear at least one set of footsteps continuing to follow her path along the creek bed. One of the soldiers had been smart enough not to fall for the deception. Sarah increased her pace, jumping from rock to rock to avoid leaving clear footprints in the sandy bottom of the creek. But her pursuer was gaining ground, and she knew that a direct confrontation was inevitable. The submachine gun her father had given her felt heavy in her hands as she prepared for what might be her final firefight. The canyon walls rose steeply on both sides of the creek, offering very little in the way of cover or concealment. Sarah would have to make her stand in the open, relying on speed and accuracy to overcome her opponent's advantage in training and equipment. She chose her ground carefully, taking position behind a large boulder where the creek made a sharp turn. From this location, she would be able to see her pursuer before he could see her, giving her a crucial fraction of a second advantage in any engagement. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the soft hiss of radio communications. The soldier was reporting his position to his teammates, calling for backup to support his pursuit. Sarah knew that even if she won this fight, more enemies would be arriving soon. When the soldier finally appeared around the bend in the creek, Sarah was ready for him. He was young, probably not much older than herself, wearing the same tactical gear and carrying the same type of automatic weapon as the men she had encountered earlier in the forest. But this soldier was more cautious than his predecessors had been. He moved slowly, checking every possible hiding place before advancing, keeping his weapon ready for instant use. Sarah could see that he had been warned about her marksmanship abilities and was taking no chances. The standoff lasted for several tense seconds as each combatant tried to locate the other without exposing themselves to enemy fire. Sarah could hear the soldier's breathing, could see the barrel of his weapon as he swept it back and forth across the area where he suspected she might be hiding. When the engagement finally began, it was over almost before it started. The soldier made the mistake of stepping into the open for just a moment as he tried to get a better view of Sarah's hiding place. That moment was all she needed. Her burst of automatic fire caught him center mass, and he dropped immediately to the rocky floor of the creek. Sarah felt sick as she realized she had just killed someone who was probably not much older than herself, but she forced herself to focus on survival rather than emotions. Moving quickly to the fallen soldier's position, Sarah searched his equipment for anything useful. She found additional magazines for her submachine gun, a military radio, and a detailed map of the canyon area marked with tactical positions and escape routes. The radio was particularly valuable as it allowed Sarah to monitor the communications between the different soldier teams. What she heard was not encouraging. Miguel had been cornered in the north section of the canyon, and from the sound of the radio traffic, he was putting up fierce resistance, but was badly outnumbered. Sarah had to make a choice that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She could attempt to help her father, probably resulting in both of their deaths and the loss of the evidence they had died to protect. Or she could follow his instructions and focus on completing the mission, ensuring that the truth about the weapons corruption scandal would eventually reach the public. The decision was made for her when she heard Miguel's voice over the radio, speaking directly to the soldier commander. "This is Miguel Martinez." Her father's voice crackled through the radio speaker. "I know you can hear this. I'm prepared to surrender, but I want to negotiate terms." "What kind of terms?" came the response from the soldier commander. "Let my daughter go. She's not part of this, and she doesn't know anything about the classified information you're looking for. In exchange, I'll turn over everything I have and come quietly." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she realized what her father was doing. He was sacrificing himself to give her a chance to escape, even though they both knew that his captors had no intention of letting either of them live. "Negative," the commander responded. "Both targets must be captured for debriefing. Continue the pursuit." The radio went silent for a moment, and then Miguel's voice came back on the channel, but this time he was speaking in a code that Sarah recognized from their hunting trips. Her father was giving her tactical information about the soldiers' positions and movements disguised as surrender negotiations. Using the information Miguel was providing, Sarah was able to plot a course through the canyon that would avoid the main concentrations of enemy forces. But she also realized that her father was revealing his own position to help her, making it easier for the soldiers to close in on him. The sound of gunfire echoed through the canyon, brief but intense. Then, Miguel's voice disappeared from the radio, replaced by the efficient communications of soldiers reporting mission status and requesting extraction. Sarah knew that her father was either dead or captured, and either way, she was now completely on her own. The weight of the evidence case seemed to double as she realized that she was now the only person who could ensure that Miguel's sacrifice would not be in vain. Following the mining road that her father had mentioned, Sarah began the long climb out of Devil's Canyon. The path was steep and difficult, winding back and forth across the canyon wall as it gradually ascended toward the rim. Each step carried her farther from her father and closer to a world where she would have to navigate dangers she had never imagined. Behind her, the sound of helicopter engines grew fainter as the soldiers concluded their operation and began withdrawing from the canyon. They had achieved their primary objective of capturing or killing the witnesses to the weapons corruption scandal, but they had failed to secure all of the evidence. As Sarah reached the top of the canyon, she could see the lights of the interstate highway in the distance. Freedom was just a few miles away, but she knew that reaching the highway would be only the beginning of her real journey. The people who had killed her father and destroyed her life had resources and influence that extended far beyond the mountains of her hometown. But Sarah Martinez was no longer the teenage girl who had set out that morning to track a wounded deer. She had been forged by violence and lost into something harder, more dangerous. And she carried with her the evidence that could bring down the conspiracy that had cost her everything she cared about. The war was far from over, and Sarah intended to finish what her father had started. The final stand. 3 months had passed since Sarah escaped from Devil's Canyon. And in that time, she had learned that survival in the civilized world could be just as dangerous as combat in the mountains. The evidence she carried had made her a target for assassins, corporate security teams, and corrupt government officials who would stop at nothing to prevent the truth from coming to light. The journalist Rebecca Chun had been killed in a car bombing just 2 days after Sarah first contacted her. The second journalist Sarah approached had disappeared entirely, along with his entire family. It became clear that the conspiracy was monitoring communications, tracking anyone who showed interest in the weapons corruption story. But Sarah had learned from her father's training and her own bitter experience. She had gone underground, using false identities and staying constantly on the move while she searched for someone with the resources and integrity to handle the explosive information she carried. Her search had finally led her to Senator Patricia Williams, a former military officer turned politician who had built a reputation for taking on defense contractor corruption. Williams had agreed to meet with Sarah, but only after extensive security precautions and verification of the evidence's authenticity. The meeting was scheduled to take place at a remote cabin in the Adirondack Mountains, far from the surveillance networks that monitored Washington, D.C. and other major cities. Sarah had arrived early to scout the location and ensure that it was secure, using all the tradecraft her father had taught her during their years together in the wilderness. But as she observed the cabin from a concealed position in the surrounding forest, Sarah realized that something was wrong. There were too many vehicles parked nearby, too many people moving around the building for what should have been a simple meeting between two individuals. Through her binoculars, Sarah could see men in tactical gear positioning themselves around the cabin's perimeter. They were trying to appear casual, but their movements and equipment gave them away as professional soldiers. The meeting was a trap, just like so many others she had narrowly escaped over the past 3 months. Sarah was about to withdraw from the area when she spotted Senator Williams arriving in an official government vehicle. The politician was not part of the trap. She was walking into it just as Sarah had almost done. Whatever was about to happen, Williams was intended to be a victim, not a co-conspirator. The realization changed everything for Sarah. She could escape again, continue running, and hiding while trying to find someone else to trust with the evidence. Or she could take direct action to save Williams and complete her father's mission, even though it would almost certainly cost her own life. Sarah made her choice based on what Miguel Martinez would have done in the same situation. A good soldier did not abandon civilians to enemy action, especially when those civilians were trying to help. Moving carefully through the forest, Sarah worked her way to a position where she could observe the tactical situation more clearly. She counted at least 8 armed men positioned around the cabin, all carrying automatic weapons and communication equipment. There was also a sniper positioned on a hill overlooking the building, probably intended to eliminate any witnesses after the primary operation was completed. The plan appeared to be simple: allow Williams to enter the cabin, then eliminate both her and Sarah when they were together in a confined space. The deaths would probably be blamed on domestic terrorists or foreign agents, providing cover for the real killers. Sarah had been armed with nothing more than a hunting knife and a small pistol she had acquired during her months on the run. Against 8 professional soldiers, her chances of success were essentially 0. But she had one advantage that the enemy could not account for. They did not know she was there. The element of surprise had served Sarah well during her escape from the mountains, and it would have to be enough to see her through this final confrontation. But first, she needed to even the odds by acquiring better weapons and eliminating some of the enemy soldiers before they realized they were under attack. The sniper on the hill was Sarah's first target. He was isolated from the other soldiers and would not be missed immediately if he disappeared. More importantly, he was carrying a military-grade rifle that would give Sarah the long-range capability she needed to engage the other enemies. Moving like a ghost through the underbrush, Sarah approached the sniper's position from behind. The man was focused on the cabin below, watching for any sign of his intended targets. He never saw Sarah coming until her knife found the space between his ribs, ending his life quickly and silently. Sarah took the sniper's rifle and settled into his position, using the scope to survey the tactical situation around the cabin. Senator Williams had entered the building and was probably wondering why Sarah had not yet appeared for their meeting. The other soldiers were growing restless, checking their watches and radio equipment as they waited for orders to begin the operation. From her elevated position, Sarah had clear shots at 3 of the soldiers positioned around the cabin's perimeter. But once she started shooting, the others would immediately take cover and begin hunting for her location. She would need to move fast and make every shot count. Sarah chose her targets carefully, prioritizing the soldiers who carried radio equipment and those positioned to cut off escape routes from the cabin. When she was ready, she took a deep breath and began the engagement that would determine whether her father's sacrifice had any meaning. Her first shot dropped the soldier who appeared to be the team leader, recognizable by his position and the way the others occasionally looked to him for guidance. The second shot eliminated the radio operator, cutting off the team's communication with their command structure. The third shot took down the soldier positioned to cover the cabin's rear exit. By the time Sarah fired her fourth shot, the remaining soldiers had located her position and were returning fire. Bullets whined off the rocks around her hiding place as she scrambled to relocate before they could coordinate an effective response. But Sarah had bought Williams the time she needed to escape from the cabin. Through her rifle scope, Sarah could see the senator's vehicle racing down the mountain road, carrying with it the woman who might finally be able to bring the truth to light. The remaining soldiers were now focused entirely on Sarah, advancing up the hill in a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm her position through superior numbers and firepower. She had perhaps 2 minutes before they reached her location, and her ammunition was running dangerously low. Sarah made the decision to abandon her defensive position and take the fight to the enemy. Using the terrain to mask her movements, she worked her way around the soldiers' flank, approaching them from a direction they did not expect. The close-quarters battle that followed was unlike anything Sarah had experienced during her earlier encounters with enemy forces. These soldiers were alert to the danger she posed and were working together as a coordinated team. But Sarah had advantages of her own: intimate knowledge of the terrain, desperation born of having nothing left to lose, and skills learned from the finest military instructor she had ever known. The fight moved through the forest in a deadly game of hide and seek, with Sarah using every tree, rock, and depression in the ground to avoid enemy fire while seeking opportunities to engage her opponents. She had learned to think like a predator during her months on the run, and now she put those instincts to deadly use. One by one, the soldiers fell to Sarah's rifle or her knife, victims of their own overconfidence and unfamiliarity with the mountainous terrain. But each engagement left Sarah more exhausted and depleted her ammunition supply further. By the time she faced the last two soldiers, she was down to a single bullet and her knife. The final confrontation took place in a small clearing where Sarah had deliberately allowed herself to be cornered, drawing the last two soldiers into a position where they could not use their superior firepower effectively. At close range in dense forest, her speed and agility gave her the advantage over enemies who were weighed down by heavy equipment and tactical gear. Sarah used her last bullet to drop one of the soldiers, then closed with the other before he could bring his weapon to bear. The hand-to-hand combat that followed was brief but vicious, a life-or-death struggle between a trained soldier and a young woman who had been hardened by months of constant danger. When it was over, Sarah stood alone among the bodies of her enemies, bloodied but alive. She had completed the mission her father had given her, ensuring that the evidence of weapons corruption would finally reach someone who could act on it. In the distance, Sarah could hear the sound of sirens as Senator Williams's security detail responded to the attack. Soon, the forest would be filled with law enforcement officers investigating the scene and trying to piece together what had happened. Sarah gathered the evidence case and began walking toward the sound of the sirens. She was tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of living in constant fear of discovery. It was time to come in from the cold and let others carry the burden of seeking justice for her father and the other victims of the conspiracy. As she emerged from the forest with her hands visible and empty, Sarah Martinez looked nothing like the teenage girl who had set out to track a wounded deer just 3 months earlier. She had been transformed by violence and lost into something harder, more dangerous. She had learned to kill without hesitation, to survive against impossible odds, and to complete a mission regardless of personal cost. But she had also learned something else during her months of solitude and struggle, that some things were worth fighting for, no matter the price. The truth about her father's death, justice for the victims of corruption, and the hope that future generations might live in a world where such conspiracies could not flourish in the shadows. Sarah Martinez had kept her promise to her father. The evidence would reach the right people, the truth would come to light, and the people responsible for so much death and suffering would finally face justice. It had cost her everything she had ever cared about, but some prices were worth paying. As the first law enforcement officers reached her position, Sarah allowed herself to smile for the first time in months. The war was finally over, and somehow, impossibly, she had won.